Hello again. My mother, like many British people of the generation which endured the Second World War, did not like Germans. Her dislike wasn't limited to those men who had actually fought in the war against Britain. It included all Germans, even those who hadn't even been born when the war ended in 1945. We in the family remonstrated with her in vain as she grew older, but it was all to no avail. She thought that the entire German nation shared a collective guilt for the excesses of the Nazi regime and that nothing could eradicate that. Time didn't matter in this sense. Anyone that was born in Germany was a German and therefore tainted with the association with Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. It need hardly be said that this attitude was completely loopy, and none of the younger members of the family shared it. They would happily buy German goods and socialise with Germans. I mention this because although most people will see at once how foolish and illogical it would be to blame young Germans for the possible actions of their grandfathers and great-grandfathers, there are those who would found official policies today in both Britain and the United States on precisely similar and misguided ideas. I'm talking, of course, about the idea that we in the Western world, Britain and America in particular, should feel guilty about and make atonement for the transatlantic slave trade. The idea of making atonement for the sins of one's ancestors has its roots in the Bible, of course. We are told in Deuteronomy that the sins of the fathers shall be visited upon the children, even to the third and fourth generation. In other words, you might have to pay for something that your great-grandfather did. I mean, few of us take the Bible's injunctions quite so literally as that. And most people today find this a ridiculous and inhuman idea that you should be punished for something that your relatives did before you were born. Except, of course, when it comes to the slave trade, when many left-wing types will enthusiastically embrace the concept of the sins of the children, sins of the fathers being visited on the children to the third, fourth, and indeed eighth, ninth and 10th generation. I'm bound to say that I find the idea that I should feel guilty or wish to make amends for something which people who lived in the same country as me 200 years ago or more utterly bizarre and verging on the insane. My mother's grudge against Germans who were born after the war was weird, but this, I mean, at least she was worrying about things that happened 30 or 40 years ago. To think that we should have to make amends for things that happened in the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries works beyond mad. The theory behind the idea of making reparations for slavery is very simple. It is that the current prosperity of Britain and the United States has a lot to do with the slave trade. That the so-called triangular trade was a driving force for the rise of Britain as an industrial power, and that we should therefore feel a moral obligation to share our riches, to share our finances with people in Africa and the Caribbean who still allegedly suffer adversely for what our nation inflicted upon them. Let's just stop for a moment and consider how sensible this idea actually is, because we're going to be hearing more about this in the future. The Black Lives Matter campaign is predicated upon this very idea. First, in order for this concept of reparations to work, it's necessarily arbitrarily to select just 2 or 3 centuries from the world's history and focus on that time to the exclusion of all else. That is to say, we would have to limit ourselves roughly to the period perhaps beginning in the 17th century running through to the middle of the 19th century, we would also need to limit our examination of that time to certain limited geographical location and a particular set of events. There might be some justification for this if the rest of the world was at peace at that time and there were no other massacres, wars or forced relocations of populations and so on taking place anywhere else. In other words, while focusing on the Atlantic slave trade, we would have to ignore the awful events which accompanied the Manchu conquest of China, the Ottoman slave trade, the Spanish Inquisition, the suffering of the Russian serfs, and a whole lot of other things. To mention just mentioning a few of those things, an awful lot was going on in the world that was terrible during those centuries. The transatlantic slave trade was not uniquely terrible. Nobody seems to be calling for reparations for serfdom in Russia, for example, or for the actions of the Manchus in China, or reparations for anything else which happened in the world at that time. The focus is wholly and solely upon the Atlantic slave trade. Of course, a very small number of people benefited directly from the trade in slaves. My ancestors were surely not among the rich merchants who made their fortunes from slavery. I come from a long line of peasants and labourers. Even if my ancestors had been mixed up in it, I'm not really responsible for what they did centuries ago. There is also a question mark over the extent to which slavery really did enrich the nation as a whole, or made either Britain or America into prosperous countries. For this reason, a very neat piece of sleight of hand is employed. The Black Lives Matter movement is avowedly and unashamedly Marxist, in that they are opposed to capitalism and regard the police as an arm of big business, as a tool of right-wing government and state control. For this reason, the protests about the legacy of slavery, which hardly anybody felt able to criticise, particularly white people. Most people felt uneasy about criticising anything when black people were complaining about the legacy of slavery. They segued seamlessly into protests about any manifestation of colonialism in general. This means that the National Trust of all people are now listing Winston Churchill's former home of Chartwell as a site which has connections with slavery and colonialism, on the grounds that he wasn't enthusiastic enough about the matter of Indian independence and that he could have done more to prevent the famine in Bihar in 1943. That would be the same Churchill who more than any man on earth spearheaded the struggle against Nazi Germany, of course. This is a direction of travel for those who want to make slavery, which ended in British possessions 200 years ago, a live issue in the modern world. And it's as well that those who don't oppose this move can see where it's heading.